watershed scale. At the local level, we have over 100 recognized watershed stewardship groups leading on-the-ground action and projects. Alberta has two primary acts to protect our water and guide water use. The Water Act guides the allocation and withdrawal of freshwater resources and the protection of rivers, streams, lakes, wetlands, and groundwater. The Environmental Protection Enhancement Act supports protection of the environment, including measures regarding water quality and pollution prevention. There are other acts that help manage water, like the Alberta Land Stewardship Act, under which we've established water quality management frameworks, and the Fisheries Act, which supports the control of aquatic invasive species. Our legislation includes provisions for establishing water management plans. These are statutory plans and are developed for water basins to guide regulatory decisions and approvals, establish minimum in-stream flow needs, outline conditions for diversion, and set strategies to protect the aquatic environment. To further manage land use activities and the cumulative impacts, Alberta also establishes environmental management frameworks for water. These are part of our land use planning approach. Underpinning our water management activities and decisions is our monitoring, evaluation, and reporting program. It includes rivers, streams, lakes, reservoirs, surface water quality, wetlands, and groundwater. Each has a long-term monitoring approach, enabling evaluation of changes to condition and impacts of pressures over time. In many cases, these go back several decades. Monitoring programs are reviewed every 5 years, and provincial scale condition of the environment reporting is updated regularly. Our system is overseen by the Office of the Chief Scientist, who is appointed by the Minister. Alberta also recognizes and takes seriously transboundary interests. Headwater protection and the management of resources are responsibilities we have to ensure the safety and security of water for our downstream neighbors. Water flows north to the territories, east to other prairies, and south to Montana. We work closely with these jurisdictions through long-standing agreements to share and preserve the ecological integrity of cross-border waters. We have a number of priorities to increase and maintain the availability of water to support various users in our province while still maintaining the highest standards of conservation and treatment. We are undertaking new studies for reservoirs and storage, assessing water conservation efficiency and productivity, modernizing information systems to allow real-time digital information. For drought, we've released a drought response plan for 2024. Major water users in the South Saskatchewan River Basin have signed water sharing agreements, and we've put forward legislative changes to enhance action during emergencies. We're also investing $125 million for new drought and floodwater protection, about $9 million for wetland replacement programs, and $3.5 million for watershed resiliency and restoration. In closing, I'd like to mention the importance of provincial jurisdiction as the federal government reviews the Canada Water Act and establishes the Canada Water Agency. We hold different accountabilities. The Government of Alberta is the primary manager for water use, watershed management, water allocation, drinking water standards, source water protection, and power development. The federal government's role focuses on other issues like international and interprovincial pollution, clean water for federally managed land, fisheries, shipping, and navigation. It's critical for provinces to be at the forefront of any discussions where federal legislative updates may be considered that might impact provincial jurisdiction. I encourage this committee to consider the roles of the provinces and territories that they have as leaders and stewards of water as it works through its mandate. Thank you for this opportunity to provide a very quick overview of our system.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Canagan now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I appreciate the invitation to share with the committee today the Government of the Northwest Territories' perspectives on the federal government's role in protecting and managing Canada's freshwater resources. I do wish to acknowledge that I'm situated today in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, and these are treaty lands and home to many Indigenous peoples, including the Yellowknife Dene, Clecho, and Métis, and I'm grateful to be on this land. Freshwater monitoring and stewardship are key portfolios for the Government in the Northwest Territories Department of Environment and Climate Change. But much of the work that we do involves partnership, including those with the federal government, mainly the Departments of Environment and Climate Change, Natural Resources Canada, and CERNAC. And we do value these excellent partnerships and the support we receive from federal departments on freshwater initiatives, and we do want to see them to continue. I do want to provide you with some background NWT context before sharing our priorities regarding federal activities and investment in freshwater in the North. As you likely know, the Northwest Territories is very large landmass, coupled with a very small population of about 40,000 people spread out over 33 small communities. Devolution of Northwest Territories lands and resources to the GNWT occurred in 2014, but federal investment in the North remains key. Almost half of our residents are Indigenous, and fresh water in particular is of great importance to all of the Indigenous peoples of the NWT. When we speak about fresh water in the NWT, much of it is located in the Mackenzie River Basin, and that basin which is shown on a graphic provided to you in yellow, covers 1.8 million kilometers over 5 provincial and territorial jurisdictions. It's about 20% of Canada's landmass. It serves as a water source, but it's also a channel for transportation, for food, and for connection to culture and language for as long as people have lived on the lands that surround it. As you know, rapid climate change has been affecting the NWT's freshwater resources for decades. Average annual air temperatures have risen up to 4 degrees in the northwestern NWT since the 1970s, and climate change modeling predicts that the Mackenzie Valley will continue to experience some of the greatest air temperature increases in the world in coming decades. We've experienced unprecedented extreme variability in water flow in the Northwest Territories over the last 5 years. As an example, in Great Slave Lake, a water body with a period of record over 60 years, water levels went from very low in 2018 to very high and record highs in 2020 and 2022. And now we're down again to a record low in late 2023 and 24. Water levels on Great Slave Lake are determined by conditions upstream in the Mackenzie River Basin. So these extreme conditions represent huge volumes of water in the order of cubic kilometers. And this translates, as the photo shown, many meters of exposed shoreline. But more practically, it means that transportation goods can't be delivered by barge to remote communities. There's an increased cost of living for residents and to the GNWT. Some of the other experiences that we're facing are thawing permafrost and an increase in historic flooding events, as seen in some of the photos provided, as well as an increase in the frequency and size of wildfires based on levels of drought never seen before in NWT forests. So because of these new extremes, it's very difficult to predict how the Mackenzie River Basin will respond in the future under different climate warming scenarios. And NWT does have some of the largest bodies of water in the world. We're seeing big changes. So research, science, and partnerships with Indigenous knowledge holders are critical for understanding and mitigating these changes. One key point I'd like to make is that increased federal support in freshwater research and monitoring is essential. Through the Canada Water Agency and funding through the Freshwater Action Plan, we would like to see federal support for a Northern Climate Water Hub. No such hub exists in the north, and Yellowknife would provide a central location for the entire Mackenzie Basin. This hub could be a base for critical research on climate change and its impacts on freshwater. It can encourage collaboration among scientists, Indigenous knowledge holders, and policymakers, and would be responsive to the NWT's unique co-management regulatory system for land and water decision-making. I also want to highlight the role of the Mackenzie River Basin Board and a need for increased federal support there. So that the federal government plays a key role in convening provinces and territories through the board, which was created in 1997 through the Mackenzie River Basin Transboundary Waters Master Agreement between Government of Canada, Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, Yukon, and NWT. But its potential has been limited by a lack of resources. We see that an increase in staff and financial capacity for the board secretariat could enable greater research and community engagement while allowing provinces and territories to focus on implementation of their own bilateral agreements. Finally, the federal government, through Environment and Climate Change Canada, plays a key role in regulating the lower Athabasca oil sands. The federal government is now considering developing regulations that would allow release of oil sands treated effluent. As you know, the NWT is downstream of these potential releases, and as you may imagine, NWT residents have a deep concern about this possibility. So strong regulation of oil sands is critical for our downstream.
Thanks. We're going to have to stop there and go to Ms. Gilzek, who I believe is splitting her time with Mr. Mulligan. Is that correct? Go ahead, please.
Yes. We represent Government of Yukon's Water Resources Branch, responsible for water monitoring, policy, flood forecasting, and providing water-related expertise to mitigate impacts to Yukon's water. I'm Heather Drusik, the Director of the Water Resources Branch with Yukon's Department of Environment, and joining me is Brendan Mulligan, the Senior Scientist for Groundwater with the Water Resources Branch. As mentioned, we will co-present, and we are joining from the traditional territories of the Kwanlin First Nation and Tonkwachin Council. We partner with all Yukon First Nations on various water initiatives. We would like to thank the committee for the opportunity to provide our input to this process today. In the Yukon, climate change is resulting in significant impacts to water systems. Just one example is flooding, where we have seen 3 consecutive years of record flooding in the territory, resulting in real impacts and hazards for people living in the Yukon. With climate change-induced increases to extreme weather patterns, ongoing changes to flood risk are expected across the territory.
Our brief that we've submitted outlines 7 theme areas as opportunities to tailor the federal role to best advance collaborative stewardship of water in a way that we think benefits the Yukon and all Canadians. Today, we will shed water on 4 of these themes, starting with supporting understanding of groundwater.
Thank you, Heather. Groundwater is a critical resource in the Yukon. 97% of Yukoners depend on groundwater as a potable water source, making us the second most groundwater-dependent jurisdiction in Canada after Prince Edward Island. Of course, groundwater is not only critical to humans, but it sustains ecosystems by maintaining water levels, regulating temperatures, and delivering nutrients to rivers, streams, lakes, and wetlands. In recent years, the population of the Yukon has grown faster per capita than any other jurisdiction in Canada. Groundwater monitoring and aquifer mapping and characterization are increasingly important as our groundwater use increases and as various pressures increase the potential for adverse impacts to groundwater availability and quality. Our branch of Yukon government is fortunate to have long-standing, effective agreements with the Government of Canada concerning surface water quality and quantity monitoring. Despite the critical importance of groundwater, our government has no such agreement with the Government of Canada concerning groundwater monitoring or aquifer mapping and characterization. So our first recommendation is for the governments of Canada and Yukon to enter into an agreement under the Canada Water Act to provide for programs to collect, process, and provide data on the quality, quantity, distribution, and use of groundwater. This is consistent with the recommendation made in a brief that this committee received from the International Association of Hydrogeologists. Our second recommendation is to consider a cost-sharing agreement with the Geologic Survey of Canada to support aquifer mapping and characterization in the Yukon.
Our 4th theme that's provided in the brief is transboundary water management. So Yukon shares borders with Northwest Territories, British Columbia, and Alaska. There are a variety of arrangements in the Yukon and neighboring jurisdictions that support transboundary stewardship at the watershed scale. However, our largest watershed, which is the Yukon River watershed, has no formal transboundary water management arrangement. So our recommendations 5 and 6 in our brief are for the Government of Canada to support multi-stakeholder and rights holder watershed discussions for the Yukon River and to consider the establishment of an International Joint Commission Board or similar arrangement to support coordinated stewardship of the Yukon River. We are actively involved in water management agreements in the Mackenzie River Basin, which is a priority watershed in the Federal Freshwater Action Plan. Recommendation 12 in our brief is that federal funding should be made available as soon as possible for freshwater projects in the Mackenzie River Basin. Theme number 5 in our brief is understanding and aligning Government of Yukon and Indigenous treaty rights. So First Nations are a key partner in governance in the Yukon and are taking leadership in water stewardship and monitoring in the territory. Indigenous knowledge systems are valid and powerful ways of knowing the world and knowing water, yet most agencies were founded in a time when this knowledge was not recognized as it is now. Recommendation 7 in our brief is that the review of the Canada Water Act needs to be aligned with modern treaties in the Yukon and federal legislation, needs to make space for recognition of Indigenous-led water strategies and the role of Indigenous land guardians in contributing to water data monitoring networks. The 6th theme is climate change adaptation and flood risk information. So I began our remarks by emphasizing the impacts of recent flooding in the Yukon. To ensure resilience to flood risk in our changing climate, we need to ensure that our forecasts are supported by sufficient monitoring data and that resources are available to ensure that flood hazard maps are generated reliably and used to support resilient communities. Recommendation 9 in our brief is to ensure that work towards a national strategy on flood and drought is informed by realities of northern and small jurisdictions and understands the importance of supporting network expansion to meet data requirements for forecasting. And finally, recommendation 10 in our brief is to continue to advance delivery of the flood hazard and identification mapping program and consider additional work to develop resources to support jurisdictions in the flood resilience work necessary upon completion of flood hazard maps. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Now on to Mr. Cram to start the first turn of questions.
The witnesses for joining us. I've often said that one of the most enjoyable parts of this job is that we get to meet people from far and wide from different parts of this country, and that certainly includes the territories today. A couple of months ago, the committee heard from representatives also from the Yukon Territory, from Western Copper and Gold, about their Casino Mine project northwest of Whitehorse, which is going to be one of the largest critical mineral mines in Canada once it's complete. According to the company's literature, they've applied for a water use license from the territorial government. So I was wondering if the witnesses from the Yukon Territory could share with the committee the regulatory approval process that is currently in place for new mines such as this.
So in our branch, we provide expert advice into assessment processes. So the casino mine will need to go through various, processes for being able to be permitted for those activities. And Brendan, as our senior scientist of groundwater, is one of the experts within our branch that would review the project and provide input in terms of any impacts or mitigation to groundwater. And we would do the same in regards to water quality, surface water quality, and also for water balance, so like water levels and the amount of water. So our branch does review those. We're not the regulatory board. There's a Yukon Water Board that is responsible for that. And as part of the board is represented by 1/3 the federal government, 1/3 the Yukon government, and 1/3 First Nations in the Yukon. Brendan, is there anything you would add to that?
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, I would just act that any proponent would first need to go through assessment under the Yukon Environmental and Socioeconomic Assessment Act, which is federal legislation that applies here and is administered by the Yukon Environmental and Socioeconomic Assessment Board, or YESAB as we call it. And following that assessment, could pursue a water use license from the Yukon Water Board, which Heather referenced. So in that instance, my understanding is that proponent is somewhere in that YESAB process.
You described this 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 arrangement that is in place. What can we do to make sure that the federal government is not the slow 1/3 or the squeaky wheel, so to speak, so that projects can move forward in the Yukon Territory?
That's a good question. I guess on the board, I believe the people that represent the Yukon Water Board that represent the federal government are here and on that board. So I don't know that it's, and sorry, like we're not part of the Yukon Water Board, so we're not really sure how that works, but we certainly within Yukon government, we provide our expertise and input to those issues. But maybe Brendan, from a groundwater perspective, I know you have colleagues or may know of colleagues as to whether they provide input or not on some of those technical issues. Maybe that's something that you're able to speak to.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, the only comment I would add is, as far as I can tell, the federal government participates in the socioeconomic and environmental assessment process under YESA, but at least in recent years, seem to have limited participation in the water use licensing process. So they're represented on the Yukon Water Board, but they don't provide technical interventions in that process in recent years. I know they did that previously.
Okay, and you mentioned in your opening statements about the Canada Water Agency playing a positive role when it comes to groundwater in the Yukon. Could you elaborate for the committee on what exactly that would look like and why the Canada Water Agency could play a useful role instead of just having the territorial government do it all?
Sure, I can attempt to field that question, and Heather, please feel welcome to add to my response. Despite the heavy reliance on groundwater as a potable water source, as I mentioned in my remarks, we have very limited capacity to understand our hydrogeological conditions here. Our groundwater program was just formally established 10 years ago, so it's very young. We've added a few staff, but we have a very small team, so we very much rely on partnership with academics, federal government, First Nation and municipal governments, and consultants to advance our agenda. But we've had limited support on groundwater from the federal government to date. And because the hydrogeological capacity, as I understand it, of the federal government is spread across multiple departments, there's hydrogeologists working in Environment and Climate Change Canada, in NRCan, in Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. The CWA could play a role to help break down those silos and have those experts supporting people like us that need it. And as I mentioned, we do receive considerable support from Environment and Climate Change Canada, in particular with surface water quality and quantity monitoring, but no such support on the groundwater front, and that would be very welcome.
And finally, and very quickly, it has been proposed that connecting the power grids of the Yukon Territory and the province of British Columbia could have environmental and economic benefits, and would be related to BC's Site C hydro dam, which obviously would affect water policy as well. I was wondering if you could briefly provide for the committee what some of the economic and environmental benefits would be of such a proposal.
That's a pretty big question, and we're out of time.
Okay,
Would you be able
all right.
to send something in writing? That would be great.
That's certainly not part of what we work on, but we could follow up on
Okay.
that question.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Mr. Longfield.
Thank you to the witnesses, and I echo Mr. Cram's comments that it's so great to have representatives from such a vast territory in front of us today virtually. And thank you all for your work in the area of water. I do want to start around the science. The comments that Mr. Canagan made around having a science center in the north. I also sit on the Science and Research Committee. We're looking at how do we support northern science, how do we support Arctic science, and having centralized science centers. Water seems to be a big potential for us to be looking at in terms of having a center. Could you expand on that just a little bit for this study?
Thanks for the question. I think it's been described before that if climate change is like the shark, then water are the teeth. And that's one of the first places where we're seeing some of the effects. And that's why, from a Northwest Territories perspective, we're interested in bring that intersection between climate change and freshwater. We have an opportunity in the Mackenzie Basin to bring together some pretty unique things. I mentioned we have a unique kind of co-governance model in the Northwest Territories with Indigenous governments. And there's an ability to bring forward traditional or Indigenous knowledge with Western science in a place where researchers can come and actually experience that. So I think part of it is about the research, and part of it is about having a physical location. We have a good example of such a place in Nunavut, Northwest Territories, where there's a lot of researchers that come to. It's the Western Arctic Research Center, or WARC. And having something like that in Yellowknife, where researchers can come to as a destination, makes a lot of good sense. Yellowknife is a good place for it too, because it is a logistical hub. It's easy to get to. And we are experiencing, as I mentioned, climate change at quite a significant rate compared to the rest of the world, compared to the rest of the Arctic. It's a good place to study climate change.
I wasn't going to go down this road, but you've just tempted me. Nathan Obed was one of our witnesses this morning and talked about north-south governance and how a lot of the governance with the Inuit communities are with the provinces below them in the south of them, and the complexity of that arrangement that the federal government has made over decades, century, versus having north-to-north governance. And could you speak about the importance of collaborating with north-to-north discussions so people in the area are the ones that are directly involved?
Thanks. I think you raised a really important point, and it's the way we do business in the Northwest Territories, and there's no way for government of the Northwest Territories to proceed without the partnership and collaboration of Indigenous governments in the territory or in the region that we're talking about. It's just the way that that things proceed, and it's the co-management system was developed in the late 90s and then instituted in the early 2000s, and that's one step in the progression. And I think we're just moving along with UNDRIP legislation and moving forward in terms of reconciliation.
And with the limited amount of time, the path of reconciliation has been faster in some areas than others, science being one of the slowest areas, which is one of the surprising things, that Indigenous traditional knowledge, particularly in this case around water, hasn't been included in our funding formulas, as an example. Could you maybe expand on that just a little bit as well, just so we can try and get the sense of how important it is to be working on reconciliation as it relates to water and water science?
Thanks. I'll take it back to a really practical example. So we're talking about the Mackenzie River Basin Board and some bilateral agreements. So the government in the Northwest Territories and Alberta have a bilateral agreement for our shared waters. And one of the parts of that agreement is that we'll value and use traditional or Indigenous knowledge on par with Western science. It's easy to commit to that, but it's harder to actually put it into practice. And we've had this agreement since 2015. We're only now getting to the point where we're really taking the steps that are needed to get there. And what it has involved is first building an ethical space with Indigenous government representative partners to have those conversations, and then working at their pace and their scale to understand what are the tools. We start off with kind of the idea of a framework, but it's morphed into something else.
So as the Canada Water Agency is looking at the Mackenzie Basin, could you maybe for the record let us know how important it is that this discussion we're having is included with discussions with Indigenous communities as they look at the Mackenzie?
Yeah, we're going to have, we've got to stop. I mean, 2 seconds if you want, Mr. Canagan, just for 5 seconds. I mean, or send an answer in writing. It's just we have to stop and vote now. And,
10 seconds on my clock, but I forgot about the other clock.
yeah. So we'll be right back. We have to take a couple of minutes to vote. We'll be right back. So I'll just suspend. OK, alors on reprend et on reprend avec...
Okay, so we will resume with Ms. Posey.
Thank you to our witnesses for being present. My first question is for Madam Rich. But Mr. Canagan, a bit earlier you talked about oil sands, and I want to come back to that with you with some data that I might have to share in a few minutes. So I'd like to start with you, Ms. Rich. In this study about a year ago, we heard Chief Adams from the Chippewan First Nation. And during this study, we heard Chief Tucaro from the Nikisu First Nation. These people, when they came here, of course, talked about the toxic effluent tailings ponds above them, but they had a lot of concerns with respect to oil sands. And in 2023, your agency confirmed that for 2022 alone, 4 oil companies in the oil sands had used more than 200 billion liters of fresh water for 8 projects. And the Alberta government produced a presentation in 2024 on risk management related to droughts, and this presentation focused on drought issues and indicated that 9 rivers were all considered as having very low water levels. And this presentation also said that without significant precipitation, the levels of the water during the spring will be catastrophic. So my question for you, Madam Rich, is have you analyzed the conflictual uses of the resource? So on the one hand, protecting the environment and health, and also the economic use of water. And have you analyzed this in any way? Because of course, if there's a conflictual use of the resource, all Albertans will suffer from it since they all depend on water. And this is something that's necessary to the survival of communities, including Indigenous communities, and the survival of ecosystems, indeed.
Thank you for the question. A lot in there, but I will start by noting that, as noted, our Water for Life strategy recognizes that we need to use water for 3 main purposes. I went through the goals, but it really is for people, for the aquatic environment, of course, and for our economy. And so we do think about that in our management of water. And I'll start with oil and gas and then maybe add some things on drought, if that's okay. To be fair, I want to note that oil and gas water use is highly regulated in Alberta. And we actually have a policy that we've had since 2006. It's a water conservation policy where we ask that water licenses are only issued, obviously, for anything when there's sufficient water for existing users. But that said, for oil and gas in particularly, we have a water conservation policy for upstream oil and gas. And it asks that no freshwater resources be used unless it must be. So I just want to be clear, whether it's reuse of water, whether it is saline sources, that is our policy first and foremost. And in the oil sands mining sector, I think in 2022, we had a drop of intensity of freshwater use of about 20% from, I think, 2017 to 2013. And on average, about 76% of the water used in oil sands is recycled. So that is a really important part of our policy. Now, I also mentioned that, like other regions of Canada, we go through cycles of drought, etc.
Je m'excuse, là, juste une...
Apologies to, I'll cut you off. What you use in the tar sands is still fresh water. With climate change, we know that there will be a shortage of water. You're saying that you recycle the water and that there are basins, but there are also tailing ponds, that water is not recuperable and reusable. I'd like you to address the issue of conflict of usage, which regards to the health and environment and Indigenous nations in the Coal mine and the economy.
Yeah, so I want to be clear that I think it's about 3/4 of water used in minor oil sands is recycled. So I just want to make that clear. And I think the water that we withdraw is less than 1% of annual flow of that river. And that is because we do encourage the recycling and reuse of said water through operations to minimize any withdrawal. Now, I think you're also talking water use and management of tailings as well, which is a little bit separate. So I want to be clear for our oil sands, mine water, and tailings reclamation policy. We do look at all the monitoring and everything associated with that. And we do have our oil sands environmental monitoring program in Alberta, which is a $50 million per year program that is overseen and implemented not just by the Government of Alberta and Environment and Climate Change Canada, but also by Indigenous communities in the region and industry, and includes monitoring of air, land, water, etc. And that is an important feature for us and includes community-based monitoring. When we look at
je vous arrête encore un peu, madame, parce que tantôt.
I'd just like to cut you off because I'd like to refer to something that was said earlier by Mr. Hannigan. He said that they are upstream of the tar sands, and the water used for the tar sands, or that will, that they won't be able to use because there will be a shortage, is affecting them. No time for an answer. On to Ms. Zerillo.
Zerillo.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to ask for the Government of Yukon, Ms. Jiruzek? Jiruzek, does that sound correct? Just wanted to talk a little bit about the next generation of resource extraction. I know that Yukon has committed some dollars to some exploration as well. And my question is, as the demand for critical minerals rises, what steps are being taken by the government, the Yukon government, to ensure the water needed for mining does not interfere with freshwater security? And how does that fit with Yukon's legal obligations to First Nations that are those legal obligations that are unique to Yukon?
Sorry, can I just have you repeat the question? There's a couple of questions in there, just so I can write them down.
Sure. So I'm just wondering, around the critical mineral extraction, what steps are being taken by your government to ensure that the water needed for mining does not interfere with freshwater security? And then I'm also interested to know more about how does that fit with Yukon's legal obligations to First Nations? And I think that those legal obligations are unique for Yukon as compared to other parts of Canada. So I'm interested in some information on that.
Okay, just starting with the first one, ensuring, water needs are there. So, as both Brendan and I talked about, there's the YESAB process for assessing a project, and then there's the water license process. So through that process, we have the opportunity to provide input on those applications and water use and deposit of waste. So at least in terms of what we can do in our branch is provide input to any of the impacts that we see and to suggest mitigations for that. So that's, one part of the process. And then in regards to legal obligations to First Nations, again, First Nations are on the decision-making board for the water board. There are different elements within final agreements in Chapter 14 of the final agreement, which is specific to water, that talks about the quantity, quality, and rate of flow, if that is to be altered in a traditional territory. So, there's elements of that are protected. So in terms of the legislative part, honestly, that's not something that we work with every day. And we would refer to the Yukon Water Board or the Aboriginal Affairs branch to provide input on stuff like that. But that's the information that I can provide, unless, Brendan, you have anything else that you could offer there.
Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and just wanted to ask a little bit about community consultation on that. So we know that the first generation of resource extraction in this country didn't have a lot of regulation around the use of fresh water, and we know that First Nations were impacted, but we also know that women, it's a gender issue, that women are disproportionately impacted by the lack of fresh water. And I'm just wondering if there was community consultation around water when certain mining projects are funded or decided on. Is there community consultation, and is there community consultation with First Nation women and how it impacts their lives?
That's a really great question. And again, we provide one piece of the assessment process. So I certainly, when there is a big project like casino or projects like that, there would be a public hearing typically for something like that, where it's a public event where interveners, including technical staff like Brendan, would attend to provide input around impacts. But I do believe, and Brendan, maybe you can add in here that certainly the first or the company would typically set up something with the First Nation government and have ongoing consultation meetings through that process. But again, we're just an outside player in the process, but certainly through YESA and the water board process, there is consultation processes, but the degree to which they do engage, I'm not sure.
Okay, and then I just probably don't have time for more than one more, but I just wanted to ask, how has the Canada Water Agency ensured that those northern voices and Indigenous voices have been heard?
Thank you for the question. Yes, we have certainly been engaged in the process. In 2020, when we were first engaged on it in 2021, actually both Julian and I were Northern panelists on a regional presentation that we provided through the Canada Water Agency. But yeah, we have been providing input. We provided, I think, about 20 pages worth of comments, many of those which we provided here in our brief today, certainly regarding groundwater, the transboundary issues. We've certainly provided that input to the Canada Water Agency process.
And are there any bilateral agreements that would be relevant around freshwater that this committee should know about?
Absolutely. Yes, we have a bilateral agreement with the National Hydrometric Program, so Water Survey of Canada. We have a bilateral agreement, and it is that agreement specifically that we would love to see similar on the groundwater side of things. It's for surface water. We've been having that agreement, I think, in place since 1970s, and it's a very important agreement for us. We'd like to see that on water quality and groundwater as well.
All right, Mr. Chair, do I?
We have 15 seconds.
That's fine, thank you.
Okay, we'll go into our second round with Mr. Leslie for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start with the Government of Alberta, Ms. Rich. Just, I guess, perhaps an opportunity, recognizing that it is a municipal issue, but it has been all over the news over the past few days, so perhaps you might have a bit of an update regarding the situation of water availability for drinking and other purposes within the city of Calgary, and secondarily to that, whether or not you have any recommendations to the federal government as it relates to water infrastructure challenges and ways to address future issues such as what we're seeing happening right now.
Thank you, and thanks for recognizing the people of Calgary and the work that they're going to on a boil water advisory and a water shortage due to some infrastructure issues that they have going on. So I can assure you that the city itself, as well as others, are working hard to repair that and making sure communication is out there to keep and protect the safety of Albertans. And I should note, it's actually quite rare to have any boil water advisory in Alberta. So I think it also takes a bit of attention there, but it does show the continuous need to maintain our infrastructure and enhance our infrastructure. And so that is kind of one of those areas where we look at it, and you rightly point to say, what are some areas where we look at the agency or the Canada Water Act? Probably more so the agency than the act to look at. And obviously federal provincial coordination on information and knowledge sharing and science, which is what you've heard from others, but prioritizing and frankly sustained and increased funding for critical infrastructure is a really important piece for provinces like Alberta, whether it's for drinking water systems and regional systems like that or storage and reservoirs. We've heard about changing climate and adaptation, and the need to look and modernize our infrastructure is really, really important. And that's founded in everything from investing not only in research and knowledge networks for freshwater science, but dare I say, clean technology for efficiency and conservation and other purposes. But it is really sustained and long-term investment.
Thank you for that, Ms. Rich. Maybe I'll just stick with you regarding what I don't think has been discussed today, but certainly was brought up by my colleague in the government of Saskatchewan, and I know Alberta has undertaken or is undertaking major expansions to irrigation projects in the province, I think including covering existing canals, amongst other things. I'm just wondering if you might be willing to expand on some of the projects, how they're being funded and or supported by the federal government, and why the province is taking such a strong direction to enhance the irrigation capabilities for farmers across the province.
I may have to get back to you with the details of exactly what is funded by the province versus the federal government. So we will get back to you in writing, but I assure you that we do continue to invest not only in expanded irrigation infrastructure, but the government of Alberta is very much committed to conservation efficient and productive water use, meaning we'd like to get more bang for the buck out of each drop of water invested. So we have, starting in 2004, 2005, really made enhancements throughout our irrigation networks to improve any leaks or drips or systems to really enhance the productivity of what we get and make sure that every drop is used. So we do continue to expand our irrigation infrastructure. I will have to get back to you on Fed funding versus provincial funding.
Thank you. And I'll stick with you, but expand to the other witnesses here regarding the Canadian Water Agency and some of the engagement you have had or not had. And I know, Ms. Rich, you mentioned the critical role of understanding the role of the federal government versus the provincial government, particularly in terms of regulation and what jurisdictional boundaries should and should not be crossed. Ms. Rich, what sort of engagements has the federal government had with you or your department or the government of Alberta more broadly in terms of what the Canadian Water Agency is anticipated to do, what it could do, and what are your views on how that has progressed thus far?
Our engagement has been limited to date. I would think a handful or a few of meetings, recognizing that we're trying to be patient, know that these things take time, but we do recognize that Canadians expect us to respect our jurisdictional division of powers, respect the Constitution, respect our authorities and our existing systems, and want these investments to be made in enhancements, not duplication. So we do look at opportunities for, as I said, I mentioned, facilitating information sharing and knowledge, prioritizing funding for infrastructure and the like. But what we want to avoid duplication. We want to maintain clarity between provincial jurisdiction and federal and policies and ensure, frankly, that our jurisdiction is.
Thank you. Madame Châtel, à vous la parole.
Ms. Châtel, on to you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for coming to this final meeting on the freshwater study. I'd like to start with Mr. Jerusek. In the Yukon, you mentioned earlier that groundwater is a major issue for the Yukon. This is the case due to climate change, and farmers in my riding and across Canada have many concerns. We don't have the data, which is what I think you mentioned earlier. There's an advantage to having access to data. Can you perhaps expand on what you need and the role that the Canada Water Agency can play in collecting data on groundwater and how that might be of help to you?
I will defer that one to Brendan Mulligan as our senior scientist of groundwater. He's best placed to answer here.
Thank you, Heather. Yeah, I think, as I mentioned in our opening remarks there, one of our recommendations is a cost-sharing agreement with the Geological Survey of Canada, because mapping the aquifers underlying our communities, which supply us with groundwater, is a critical and foundational hydrogeological step that we've yet to take in most communities in Yukon. And I know there's considerable capacity within NRCan to support on that, capacity that's lacking in the government of Yukon. We also noted a recommendation to enter into an agreement under the Canada Water Act to support us with groundwater monitoring. So we do have a fairly robust groundwater monitoring network, but it's not supported by the federal government's, unlike our surface water quality and quantity monitoring networks. And I think we could do quite a bit more work with some federal dollars, in particular, drilling observation wells to understand groundwater levels and chemistry is a very expensive task, and we have limited budgets to be able to expand our observation well network to provide critical information in places of need. So additional resourcing to be able to drill new wells, to expand our network, to provide critical data for decision makers is something that would be welcome.
And I'd like to add that this is actually an important federal role. Like, it's transboundary, it's climate change related. This is information that supports not just Yukoners, but all Canadians.
Merci, c'était une...
Thank you. That was actually a great addition to our study, Ms. Jurisic and Mr. Mulligan. Thank you for that observation. Ms. Rich, on the same point, our farmers need groundwater. It is absolutely essential to farming. There is a shortage of water in your province, but also in Quebec. We are very concerned, and we want a sustainable form of agriculture and one that is resilient in the face of climate change. With the data on groundwater, would the Canadian Water Agency be able to help our farmers due to the data that they have and with the help of the farmers?
Thanks. I'm just waiting for the translation, so apologize for the delay. Yeah, groundwater is an area where we are continuing to invest in a province. We would always welcome more information and more collaboration to better understand water systems as a whole, including the interaction of groundwater and surface water in some of those shallower aquifers. So I know that we have enhanced our investments in inventories and monitoring for groundwater, especially in the south, but across Alberta. And so we have put more resources to this in Budget 2024, and we would certainly welcome that, not only for farmers, but frankly, any user in Alberta.
Kennigan, si j'ai un peu de temps encore.
I think I have a little bit of time left. There's a co-management model with regards to the freshwater basins. You've worked with municipalities and various Indigenous communities. Can you tell us more about the practices that you've put in place when trying to put in place collaborative programs with regards to the watersheds?
I'm just checking if that's directed to Alberta.
Pardon, c'était pour les territoires du Nord-Ouest.
For the Northwest Territories.
Thank you. So I think the co-management processes that are put in place in the Northwest Territories, again, stem from settled land claims. So the Inuvialuit, Gwich'in, and Sahtu land claims that were settled in the early 1990s. And then there was a legislation produced known as the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act. And with respect to freshwater, one of the key principles is that ecological integrity is maintained for the ecosystem. And so when co-management boards that are formed in a similar way to what Heather was describing in the Yukon, with different representatives from Canada, from the territories, and from Indigenous governments, when they're making decisions about projects, they're making it with those principles in mind.
Good, thanks.
And
we have to go now to Madame Posé, but I think she wants to continue the line of questioning.
Oui, effectivement, ma collègue.
Indeed, my colleague Ms. Châtel asked the question that I wanted to ask you about watersheds. Many witnesses appeared here during this study and talked about watersheds. Your practices are qualified as being exemplary in the Northwest Territories. You've renewed agreements for management and that would be collaborative between the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. So I think that's fantastic because these are long-term commitments that are collaborative in spirit. Do you think that the federal entity, being the Canada Water Agency, would impact your current management, be they positive or negative?
Thanks for the question. I think that the governments of the territories are perhaps in a different situation that I described at the beginning of my presentation than provinces are, in that we've devolved certain functions from the federal government, but there's other functions that are still held by the federal government. And so we do rely, because of these small populations and low tax base, really, relied much on federal funding. And so we see a Canada Water Agency and a Freshwater Action Plan as an opportunity for us to collaborate with federal government partners to achieve some of the objectives that we and our Indigenous government partners would like to do.
Donc, je comprends qu'effectivement.
So if I understand correctly, your approach is always a collaborative one. Mr. Canagan, you talked about tar sands. Alberta says that they are at the fourth stage on 5 with regards to the emergency situation for droughts. Some rivers are suffering from great shortages. Will you be impacted by this?
Thank you. So as I mentioned, we do have a transboundary water agreement with Alberta. And one of the key pieces of that agreement are agreement about how we share water, or what the triggers are, or the objectives for when that water quantity is lower and it may be impacting ecological integrity of the aquatic ecosystem. And so we're working through one of those processes right now. We do have low water levels in the Mackenzie Basin. And for example, there's low water levels in the Hay River Basin, which is a shared basin. And we'll collaboratively move forward to understand what those interests are. Thank you.
Thanks. Ms. Zerillo.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to carry on also asking Mr. Canagan some questions. So I wanted to just go back to climate change. It was mentioned today. My NDP colleagues and Laurel Collins from this committee have been advocating for stronger freshwater protections, and I'd like to add to my question today around groundwater too, but have been advocating for stronger freshwater and groundwater protections in place to help prevent wildfires. Could you please share with us here on committee what stronger freshwater and groundwater protections would mean? What would they mean for the Northwest Territories?
One of the key learnings, I guess, for me over the past number of years is the drought that we're currently experiencing in the Northwest Territories isn't related to water use. It's more about climate change, and it's more about something that we've never seen before, which is a meteorological system that's over the entire basin. And so these drought codes that we're seeing are related to climate more than usage of water. We're seeing that water being passed across the border and into our jurisdiction. And what we need to do is think more about climate change and how we will adapt to that in our management.
And do you see a role for the federal government to help in understanding and proactively preparing for this? And I think even about natural infrastructure, like where can the Government of Canada and the new water agency assist in understanding this and helping prevention?
Oh, no, thanks for the question. I mean, in so many ways, I think one really clear way is this new regime where we have extreme variability. It's really hard to predict from year to year what's going to happen. And we need new tools and new modeling to indicate what are those conditions going to be in the near and medium term so that we can better plan.
And are there experts out there? Are there countries, are there governments ahead of this that we could be looking to here in Canada?
The government of the Northwest Territories is currently working with researchers at University of Calgary to look at the current regime in the Mackenzie River Basin. And I know there's other experts within the country.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Deltel.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to all of you. Thank you for participating. and contributing to this great big country. And of course, as my colleagues mentioned earlier, it is always a pleasure for me to exchange with people in the territories. I had the luck of being able to go to the Northwest Territories and to the Yukon. When I went to Yellowknife, they said, don't talk about Whitehorse. And when I went to Whitehorse, they said, don't mention Yellowknife. So I notice that there might be a little bit of friction. And of course, since as a Quebecer, I understand that. And my friends from Montreal will also understand that. On to more serious matters. One of my colleagues, Mr. Cram, mentioned the hydroelectricity needs for big projects, major projects in the Yukon. My question is therefore to the Yukon representative, Ms. Jerusik, and to Mr. Mulligan. What is your vision with regards to the fact that the Yukon might need energy coming from British Columbia, and is there a possibility of allowing that? Do you think that that British Columbia can provide energy to the Yukon?
Yeah, I'll have to get back to the committee on this, but this is in an area that we can speak to. Yukon Energy working together with there is another branch within the Department of Energy, Mines and Resources that works on this collaboratively. So we could certainly provide something back, but not anything that we're able to speak to. Sorry.
Nous savons aussi que le gouvernement.
As we know, the federal government gave itself a right of veto on C-69, which passed years ago, with regards to hydroelectricity projects. In Quebec, that has created a lot of concern over the course of many decades. We've built many dams, and this is something that is that the quality is world-renowned, and we don't need any particular authorization normally. Since 2001 and up until 2014, your governments had the ability to act autonomously. If you need to access hydroelectricity, will this bill impede your ambitions, even though we know that this is not a zone where we can easily build dams?
Sorry, the end of that translation, I wasn't quite clear, but again, anything related to hydroelectricity, certainly a hydro project, and we have hydro projects right now being renewed, they go through licensing, they go through assessment. So the bill that you're referring to, I'm not familiar with, but again, sorry, not able to answer that question.
How much time? 1 minute. So my last question will be to all of you. We have to keep in mind all the time the First Nation when we build something, when we talk about the future, and when we talk about the water. In your territories, you have more First Nation compared to the Allochthon people than in other provinces, like in Quebec. Yes, we have First Nation, but not as much as you have compared to the number of Allochthon that we have in our province. So how do you deal with that, and how can you reach out great agreement with a win-win partnership and partnership in prosperity? How do you get that?
I'm happy to start on that. So certainly there are the environmental assessment and regulatory reviews and opportunities to provide input through that process. But maybe I can touch on areas that we have that we're responsible for. And an example that we're working together with Northwest Territories and British Columbia right now is we have a bilateral management agreement on water. This is under the Mackenzie River Basin Board umbrella. And we're developing a learning plan on the Liard River. And in doing so, we're working together with elders that have knowledge on water. So, we have contracted an elder who has expertise in this area. He's developed the land and peoples relationship model. His name is Copper Joe Jack. And he has done this process in the Liard Basin where he has done an elder circle collecting knowledge about water from the basin and bringing that into our processes like land use planning, water planning. We're doing a learning plan on the Liard River. So before we do the Western knowledge side of it, we're also finding out what is the knowledge that is out there on water from an Indigenous perspective and bringing that into the process.
Thank you. Last but not least, Mr. Ali for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today to the very important study. My question is to the official from Alberta. As we all know, that Alberta is currently seeing the worst drought in 40 years. What role does your department believe climate change is playing in the current drought? Can you expand on that, please?
Yeah, we're prairie provinces, obviously have had droughts before. We do see severity and frequency issues. So I think we have acknowledged that we do see the need to integrate monitoring on a changing climate and its impact not only on water and drought, but other systems throughout the province. So I believe there's an acknowledgement of a linkage.
So what role do you believe that Canada Water Agency can have in ensuring that we're prepared for the impacts that climate change is having on our freshwater resources?
Yeah, so this probably relates to similar things you've heard from others, deepening our understanding not only of our supplies like groundwater and surface water and with respect to changing climate or other influences, whether it's growing demand and looking at efficiencies and other pieces there. But for us, we do see that we are continuing to invest in droughts, floods, groundwater mapping, lots of items, infrastructure, thinking about a changing climate. And as I noted, we think the Canada Water Agency has a role in bringing forward some sustained funding for both infrastructure, science, and other pieces.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask pretty much similar question to the government of Northwest Territories official. That in your view, what role do you believe that Canada Water Agency can have in Northwest Territories context?
Thanks for the question. I think similar to Kate's answer, we're looking for increased support for research and monitoring and for pursuing shared objectives, collaborative objectives.
And what role do you believe that Canada Water Agencies can have in ensuring that we're prepared for the impacts of that that climate change is having on our freshwater resources?
Thanks. So I think it relates to my comment that what we're seeing in terms of climate change for the Mackenzie River Basin is across the entire basin. And I think the Canada Water Agency, situated looking at a basin scale, is in a unique position to be able to address those basin level effects and be able to then disseminate that information collaboratively with jurisdictions.
And if I could flip that same question to the government of Yukon official, please. If you
Thank you for the question.
Yeah.
We actually have recommendation number 9 in our brief that says, ensure that work towards a national strategy on flood and drought, Bill 317, is informed by realities of northern and small jurisdictions and understands the importance of supporting network expansion and to generate sufficient data for forecasting. So similar to what the others were saying as well.
And is there anything else you want to add on the Yukon side, that how that federal government should assist our sport to tackle that the issues or climate change related concern you may have?
Yeah, I think leveraging what jurisdictions are already doing in that arena is important. And, what we're doing with transboundary work right now, that there is a federal role. Transboundary is an area of federal jurisdiction as well. How can we be working together on those things, particularly at a watershed scale? But also from a climate change perspective and networks, we think about, for us, flooding has been impacting us in the last several years. How can the federal government support us in leveraging, what they're doing? We know that we have support from Environment Canada when it comes to flood mapping and NRCan. How can they continue to support in those sorts of things like forecasting, flood mapping, the things that we're seeing that are impacting Yukoners and hazards right now?
Merci. Alors, ça met...
Thank you. That ends the meeting. And in fact, to the witness testimonies for this study. So thank you to the witnesses for having concluded these deliberations and discussions. And thank you to the members for your collaboration and for having participated with such enthusiasm. There were very many interesting questions. Thank you again to the witnesses. I have a few administrative questions to bring up with the members. So thank you to the witnesses. You are free, or you can stay if you want to, because we are keeping this meeting public, but you can leave if you want to. On Tuesday, we had expected a 4-hour meeting, 2 hours with a minister and 2 hours to discuss documents related to the accelerator, the Net Zero Accelerator Fund. That is what we wanted to go ahead with on Tuesday. It turns out that the minister can't be with us because he has to make a presentation to the cabinet. We can still meet the officials for an hour. I'm just going to finish my thoughts and then we can talk about it. With regards to the Net Zero Accelerator Initiative documents, I've spoken to Mr. Major. They won't have all of the documents ready by the 18th. Everything has to be translated still. So I have had a discussion with Mr. Major. He agrees that we should start looking into this first thing in the fall. So starting from the very first meeting, we'll start looking into the Net Zero Accelerator Initiative, and all the documents will be translated and accessible. The members will also have more than just 3 days to consult the documents in a private setting. We had 3 days before the 18th, but if we do the study, if we start the study in the fall, then we'll have more time to consult the documents. And Mr. Major was in agreement. Here's my question: what do we do on Tuesday? Should we welcome the officials and without the minister? I'm open to suggestions. Mr. Longfield. I'm sorry, Mr. Leslie first, and then Mr. Longfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will defer to Mr. Mazur and your conversation. I think it is reasonable to take the time necessary for official bilingualism to be respected and have the documents properly translated. So I think that that's a reasonable perspective. And just in terms of your question towards what we might do at Tuesday's meeting, I certainly don't think we should just take the day off just because we're heading a little bit closer to summer. And I think it's worth reminding this committee that Simon Kennedy, the Deputy Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, who we've now been in receipt of 2 letters from. The original letter was a blatant disregard of the original motion seeking the production of documents relating to the Net Zero Accelerator Initiative. And when a committee orders the production of documents, deputy ministers don't just get to pick and choose what documents they are allowed to send over to that committee. And there are numerous speakers' rulings related to the production of those documents. I've mentioned them before in a previous conversation where we've had the government overrule our ability to access documents. But in summary, whether it be Speaker